Racist farmer returns from death with a shocking message from Jesus. The land stretched out endlessly under the harsh sun, rows of corn and wheat bending gently in the wind. It was the pride of Henry's life, the farm that had been in his family for generations. But there was another side to Henry, a darker one that most people in town knew about but avoided speaking of directly. He was a man of stubborn beliefs, unshakable and unyielding. Henry didn't trust anyone who didn't look like him. He'd turn his back on his black neighbors at the farmer's market, refusing to make small talk. If one of them waved to him on the road, he'd glance away as if he hadn't seen them. To him, life was divided, us and them. And he was certain that this divide was natural, even righteous. Henry's reputation spread beyond the fields. The kids whispered about him in the small-town school. "That's old man Henry. Don't go near him if you're not white." Adults sighed, but rarely confronted him. To them, Henry was just an old man set in his ways, beyond saving. Some chalked it up to his upbringing, the remnants of an older, uglier time that still clung to their community like a shadow. Despite his harsh demeanor, Henry wasn't a man without struggles. His wife had left him years ago, taking their 2 children with her. The loneliness of his farm echoed in every empty room of the creaking house. The laughter of his grandchildren was a sound he'd never heard. But even as his isolation grew, Henry never connected his misery to his own choices. To him, life had simply been unfair. One sweltering afternoon, Henry was working in his fields, the sweat dripping down his weathered face as he gripped the handles of his old plow. The sun seemed angrier than usual, beating down relentlessly, but he pushed through. The work was hard, but it was his routine, the only thing that kept his mind from wandering to the quieter corners of his life. As he leaned down to adjust a stubborn blade, a sharp pain shot through his chest. He stumbled, clutching at his heart, his vision blurring as he collapsed into the dirt. The world around him dissolved into darkness. At first, there was nothing. No sound, no sensation, just an empty void. Then, slowly, a faint light began to glow in the distance, soft and golden. It grew brighter and brighter until it engulfed him completely, a warmth washing over him that he couldn't describe. He tried to move, to speak, but his body felt weightless, as though it wasn't there at all. Suddenly, Henry realized he wasn't alone. In the distance, a figure began to approach. At first, it was hard to make out through the blinding light, but as the figure came closer, its form became clear. It was a man, dressed in simple robes, his face radiant and peaceful, yet filled with an undeniable power. Henry's breath, or whatever semblance of breath he had in this place, caught in his throat. He knew, instinctively, who this was. The man stopped a few steps away, his piercing eyes meeting Henry's. There was no anger in his gaze, no judgment, only a deep, overwhelming sadness. "Henry," the man spoke, his voice calm but resonating like thunder in Henry's ears. "Do you know why you are here?" Henry wanted to respond, to say anything, but no words came out. The man took a step closer, and Henry felt an unbearable weight settle over him, not from the man's presence, but from something inside himself. It was as if the walls he'd built around his heart were crumbling. And for the first time, he felt the full burden of the bitterness and hate he'd carried for so long. "You've lived a life filled with anger and division," the man continued, "but that is not the way. It is not what I taught." Henry's mind raced. He wanted to protest, to defend himself. "I was just living the way I was taught," he thought. "I didn't hurt anyone directly. I just stayed in my place and they stayed in theirs." But as he thought this, the man raised a hand, and Henry saw something that stopped his thoughts cold. Before him appeared a vision, like a window into another world. He saw the faces of his black neighbors, people he had ignored, insulted, or avoided over the years. He saw their pain, their struggles, some of which had been made worse by his actions or inactions. A young boy, his shoes too small, walked past Henry's farm, his face downcast because Henry had refused to sell seeds to his family. A woman wiped tears from her face after hearing Henry mutter something cruel under his breath as she walked by. "Each of them is my child," the man said softly, his voice breaking Henry's heart. "And each time you turned away, each time you chose hate over love, you turned away from me." Henry fell to his knees, or at least it felt like he did, though he wasn't sure if he had a body here. Tears streamed down his face as the full weight of his actions hit him like a storm. He had always thought of himself as a good man, a hard worker, someone who did what he was supposed to do. But now, faced with the undeniable truth, he realized how deeply he had failed. Not just others, but himself and his soul. "Please," Henry whispered, his voice trembling. "I didn't know. I didn't see it this way." The man looked at him with compassion, but did not let the moment pass without its lesson. "You have been blind, Henry, but now you see, and you must choose what to do with this vision." Henry looked up, desperate for guidance. "What do I do? How do I fix this?" "You will see," the man said simply. "But first, there is more you must understand." Before Henry could speak, the golden light around him shifted, and the man stepped aside. In the distance, a figure began to take shape, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Henry squinted, trying to make out the face. As the figure drew closer, recognition dawned. It was Nelson Mandela. Henry stood frozen as the figure approached, his heart pounding, not with fear, but with a strange, unexplainable awe. The man was tall, dignified, with an air of profound calmness and strength that seemed to emanate from him. As he drew closer, Henry could see his face, the lines of age and struggle etched into his skin, but his eyes were alive, sharp, and filled with an unmistakable light. "You know me," the man said, his voice steady, carrying both authority and warmth. Henry nodded, unable to speak. Of course, he knew him. He'd seen his face on the news, in history books, even on television documentaries he'd grumbled through when his kids were young. Nelson Mandela, the man who had fought against apartheid, spent nearly 3 decades in prison, and emerged not with vengeance, but with forgiveness. Mandela smiled gently, as if understanding Henry's thoughts. "It's not unusual for people like you to think of me only as a name, a face, a distant figure," he said. "But now, you will see me as more." Henry swallowed hard, his throat dry. What are you doing here?" Mandela's smile faded, replaced by a seriousness that made Henry feel small, like a child caught doing something wrong. "I'm here because you have been shown your life, but you have not yet been shown its consequences. I am here to teach you that hatred is not an individual act. It is a chain, binding everyone it touches. And you, Henry, have forged many links in that chain." Before Henry could respond, the world around them began to shift. The golden field faded away, replaced by scenes from Henry's own life, though they were no longer from his perspective. He saw the faces of the people he had hurt, black men, women, and children whose lives he had dismissed or made harder with his words, his actions, or his indifference. One scene stopped Henry cold. It was the image of a young boy, no more than 7 or 8, sitting on a porch with his head in his hands. The boy's clothes were worn and his eyes were red from crying. Henry recognized him as the son of a black farmer who had once come to him for help during a drought. Henry had refused to sell the man seeds, muttering that he didn't trust their kind to pay their debts. The boy's father had been forced to abandon his farm, and the boy's family had moved away, their lives uprooted. Henry felt like he was suffocating. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I didn't know it would do that to them." Mandela turned to him, his expression unreadable. "You didn't know, because you didn't want to know. Hatred is a kind of blindness, Henry. It narrows your world until you can see only yourself. But now, you will see what your actions have cost, not just others, but yourself." The scene shifted again, and Henry found himself in a graveyard. He saw a headstone with his own name on it. Around it stood his family, his 2 children now grown, their faces somber. His grandchildren were there too, though they looked confused, as if they didn't understand who the man in the grave had been. Mandela gestured toward the scene. "You see, even your own family didn't truly know you. They were touched by your hatred too, even if you didn't realize it. Your refusal to love others closed you off from them. Your grandchildren will grow up without understanding what kind of man their grandfather was, because, in truth, even you didn't know." Henry fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I don't want this," he sobbed. "I don't want to be remembered like this. I don't want to hurt anyone anymore." Mandela knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Then listen, Henry. Forgiveness is the first step, but it is not the last. Reconciliation requires action. You must return to your life and rebuild what you have broken." The world shifted again, and Henry found himself back in the golden light. Jesus stood before him once more, his presence radiant and calming. Henry's tears continued to flow as he looked up at the man who had brought him here. "I've seen it," Henry said, his voice trembling. "I've seen what I've done. I'm so sorry. Please, tell me how to make it right." Jesus looked at him with compassion, his voice steady and firm. "You cannot erase the past, Henry, but you can choose a different future. Love is the way. You must open your heart to those you once turned away from. You must show kindness, build bridges, and teach others what you have learned." Henry nodded, the weight of the truth settling deep in his soul. "I'll do it. Whatever it takes, I'll do it." Jesus stepped closer, placing a hand on Henry's chest. "Then go, Henry. Go back and live the life you were meant to live. Show the world that love is stronger than hate." There was a blinding flash of light, and then, just as suddenly, everything went dark. For a moment, Henry thought it was all over, that he was gone for good. But then he felt it, the steady beep of a heart monitor, the soft hum of hospital machines. He opened his eyes and saw the faces of his children standing over him, their expressions a mix of relief and worry. Henry blinked, his vision clearing. He felt the weight of what he had experienced still heavy on his heart, but alongside it, there was something new. Hope. A second chance. He gripped his daughter's hand, his voice hoarse but determined. "I've been given a gift," he said, "and I'm not going to waste it." Henry knew his journey was just beginning. The real work lay ahead. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid to face it. Henry's eyes fluttered open to the soft hum of the hospital room. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled his nostrils, and he felt the cool sheets beneath him. His chest ached with each breath, a stark reminder that he was still alive. As his vision cleared, he saw two familiar faces hovering over him, his daughter, Clara, and his son, Tom. Their expressions were a mix of worry and relief, and for a moment, Henry couldn't find the words to speak. Clara was the first to break the silence. "Dad, you scared us half to death," she said, her voice trembling. Her hand reached out to rest on his, and for the first time in years, Henry didn't pull away. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the concern in her eyes, the love she had carried for him despite everything. "I'm sorry," he managed to whisper, his voice raw. "I'm so sorry." Tom stepped closer, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about, Dad? You're going to be okay. The doctors said you'll make a full recovery." Henry shook his head, his throat tightening. "Not just for this," he said, gesturing weakly to the machines around him. "For everything, for the way I've lived, the way I've pushed you away, the way I've treated people." Clara and Tom exchanged a glance, confusion flickering across their faces. Henry took a deep breath, wincing at the pain, but pressing on. I had an experience," he said, struggling to put it into words. "I saw things I can't explain. I was shown my life, the pain I caused, and what it means to live in hate." Tears welled up in his eyes as he spoke, his voice cracking. "I don't want to be that man anymore. I can't be that man anymore." For a moment, the room was silent. Then Clara squeezed his hand tightly. "Dad," she said softly, her own eyes glistening with tears. "Whatever you've been through, whatever you've seen, we're here for you. We always have been." Henry nodded, gratitude flooding through him. But he knew this wasn't something he could just apologize for and move on. It was time for action. Real action. The first step came a few days after he was discharged from the hospital. As he stood on his porch, the morning sun casting long shadows across his land, Henry felt the weight of his new purpose pressing down on him. He glanced toward the neighboring fields, where the distant figure of his black neighbor James worked tirelessly. For years, Henry had ignored James, even going out of his way to avoid him. Now, Henry knew what he had to do. Gathering his courage, Henry walked across the property line, his heart pounding with each step. James looked up as Henry approached, his brow furrowing in surprise. Henry stopped a few feet away, suddenly unsure of what to say. How could he sum up a lifetime of mistakes in a single conversation? "James," he began, his voice shaky but earnest. I owe you an apology for everything, for the way I've treated you, the things I've said, or not said. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." James studied him for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, to Henry's astonishment, a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Well," James said, leaning on his rake, "I never thought I'd hear that from you, Henry, but it takes a big man to admit he was wrong." Henry felt a surge of relief, but he knew words weren't enough. "I want to do more than apologize," he said. "If there's anything I can do to help, anything at all, I want to make it right." James nodded slowly, his expression softening. "All right, Henry. Let's start with this fence between our properties. Been needing repairs for years. How about we work on it together?" Henry agreed, and for the first time in his life, he worked side by side with James, their hands blistered and their laughter mingling in the air as they rebuilt the fence. It was a small step, but it was the beginning of something far greater. Word of Henry's change began to spread through the town. At first, people were skeptical. The man who had spent years dividing the community now wanted to bring it together. But Henry was determined to prove himself. He began attending town meetings, not to speak, but to listen. He reached out to the families he had once ignored, offering help with their farms, their homes, their struggles. One Sunday, Henry stood in front of his church, the congregation murmuring in surprise as he took the pulpit. He cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edges of the podium. "I've spent most of my life living in darkness," he began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I let hate and fear rule my heart, and I hurt people because of it. But I've been given a second chance, and I want to use it to make things right." He shared his story, the vision he had of Jesus and Nelson Mandela, the pain of seeing the consequences of his actions, and the hope he now carried in his heart. As he spoke, the room grew quiet, the murmurs fading into a deep, contemplative silence. "I want to build a community where we see each other for who we are," Henry said, his voice rising with conviction. "Not by the color of our skin, but by the content of our hearts. I've learned that love is stronger than hate, and I'm asking all of you to help me prove it." The congregation erupted into applause, and one by one, people came up to Henry after the service, shaking his hand, hugging him, thanking him for his words. But Henry knew the real work was just beginning. He started organizing events to bring the town together: potlucks, barn dances, charity drives. He invited everyone, regardless of race, and worked tirelessly to make sure no one felt excluded. Slowly but surely, the barriers that had divided the community began to crumble. As Henry stood in the town square one afternoon, watching children of all races play together while their parents laughed and shared stories, he felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. It was a warmth he hadn't felt in years: hope, love, and a sense of belonging. For the first time in his life, Henry felt truly alive, and he knew, deep in his heart, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The sun was setting over the town square, casting long golden rays across the park where families gathered. The smell of freshly grilled food filled the air, mingling with the sound of laughter and music. Children raced around, their voices rising in cheerful shouts as they played tag, while adults sat at picnic tables, sharing stories, smiles, and the occasional hearty laugh. It was a scene Henry wouldn't have believed possible just a few months ago, but now, here he was, standing at the edge of the crowd, watching it all unfold with a sense of awe and quiet pride. He had dreamed of moments like this ever since his near-death experience, but to see it actually happening was something else entirely. People who had once kept to themselves, separated by unspoken lines of race and history, were now sitting side by side, sharing meals, swapping recipes, and even dancing together. It wasn't perfect. There were still awkward moments, still tensions to untangle, but it was a beginning, and that was enough. Henry made his way through the crowd, stopping to greet people along the way. He shook hands with neighbors he'd once ignored, their smiles genuine as they spoke with him. He helped an older woman carry a tray of food to her table, and she thanked him with a warmth that nearly brought tears to his eyes. Every small act felt like a piece of the bridge he was building, a bridge he hoped would stand long after he was gone. At the center of the square, a small stage had been set up for the evening's speeches and music. A microphone stood waiting, and a hush fell over the crowd as Henry climbed the steps. He hadn't planned to speak tonight, but as he stood there, looking out at the sea of faces, black, white, young, old, all gathered together, he felt something stir deep within him. He gripped the microphone, his hands trembling slightly, but his voice was steady as he began. "I used to believe that a man's worth could be measured by the color of his skin," he said, his words cutting through the quiet like a sharp wind. "I believed it because that's what I was taught, what I saw growing up. And I let that belief harden my heart for far too long." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "But I was wrong. I was so wrong, and it took nearly dying to open my eyes to see the pain I'd caused and the love I'd missed out on because of my own hatred and ignorance." Henry took a deep breath, his voice growing stronger. "I saw something when I was on the brink of death, something I'll never forget. I saw the faces of the people I'd hurt, the lives I'd made harder just because I couldn't see past my own prejudices. And I saw what it means to live without love. It's a cold, empty existence, one I wouldn't wish on anyone." He leaned forward slightly, his voice filled with urgency. "But I also saw something else. I saw the power of forgiveness, the power of love. I met Nelson Mandela in a vision, and he told me that reconciliation isn't just about saying you're sorry, it's about action. It's about building something better together. The crowd was silent, their eyes fixed on him, and Henry felt a wave of emotion rise in his chest. I've made it my mission to live by those words, to not just say I'm sorry, but to prove it every single day, to show that love really can break down the walls we've built between us. He gestured toward the crowd, his eyes glistening with tears. And tonight, looking out at all of you, I see proof that it's possible. This right here is what happens when we choose love over hate, when we choose to see each other as neighbors, as friends, as family. Henry's voice softened, but the passion in his words remained. I know we've still got a long way to go. There's still work to be done, still wounds to heal. But I believe in this town, in all of you. And I believe we can be an example, not just for ourselves, but for anyone who's willing to open their heart and try. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound washing over Henry like a wave. He stepped back from the microphone, his heart pounding as people stood and clapped, their faces filled with hope and gratitude. It wasn't just for him, it was for what they were building together. A future that felt brighter than anything Henry had ever dared to imagine. As the applause died down and the music started up again, Henry stepped off the stage, greeted by handshakes and hugs from people of all backgrounds. James, the neighbor who had once been a stranger, pulled him into a firm embrace, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a good man, Henry," he said simply. "Don't ever doubt that." Henry smiled, his chest tight with gratitude. "I'm just trying to do my part," he said. "We all are." Later that evening, as the crowd began to thin and the stars blinked to life in the night sky, Henry found himself standing by a small tree planted at the edge of the square. It was young and fragile, its leaves barely sprouting, but it stood tall against the dark. A plaque at its base read, "In honor of unity and hope." Henry reached out, his fingers brushing the bark. He thought about the message Jesus had given him, the words of Nelson Mandela, and the faces of the people who had once seemed so distant, but now felt like family. He thought about his grandchildren, who would grow up in a town transformed, a town where love and acceptance had taken root. As the cool night breeze rustled the leaves, Henry whispered a quiet prayer. "Thank you," he said, "for this chance, for this life, for them." And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Henry felt truly at peace. He stood there for a long while, the laughter and music of the square fading into the night, his heart full, his soul light. He wasn't just a man who had been saved. He was a man who had been given a purpose, and he was ready to live it.